Welcome to another TheoBrawlz deep dive on exposing Calvinism. Okay, so picture this. You are tuning into a completely raw, totally unedited theological audio room on an app called Clubhouse. The Wi-Fi is, it's incredibly shaky. Someone is quite literally folding their laundry on a hot mic.
Oh yeah, you can hear the rustling.
You can hear everything. And I'm fairly certain that the background noise of the spin cycle is, at times, much louder than the actual theology being discussed.
It's just the absolute wild west of internet apologetics. I mean, you never really know if you're going to get a profound exegesis of the Greek text or, someone's dog barking aggressively at the Amazon delivery guy.
Right, exactly. But here's the real kicker to start us off. The room is titled Exposing Calvinism. Now, if you're a listener who leans toward free will, or maybe you've just got a bone to pick with predestination, you see that title and you think, finally, a safe space, a room dedicated to dismantling Reformed theology.
Yeah, a friendly environment for Arminians.
But no, the room was actually created by Calvinists to deliberately lure in free will advocates. It is the theological equivalent of a bear trap, disguised as a picnic basket.
It's brilliant, honestly. And, slightly diabolical. You basically put up a sign saying free honey, and you just wait to see who wanders into the clearing.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack this rigorous, multi-hour internet brawl. We are looking at a conversation primarily driven by three guys. First, you have Matt. Matt is a heavy-hitting Calvinist who possesses absolutely zero chill.
None. Zero.
None at all. Then there is JT, his slightly softer-spoken wingman who sort of acts as the color commentator for the room. And finally, you have Nos. Nos is a genuinely curious but very doctrinally bound Seventh-day Adventist who just sort of wandered into the room.
Just walked right into the bear trap.
Exactly. So we are going to analyze these arguments from a sharp confessional Calvinist and presuppositional perspective. We want to break down the theology, the underlying logic, and the frankly hilarious audio app social dynamics.
Because there is so much for you, the listener, to learn here. I mean, this isn't just an exercise in critiquing a random internet chat. It's really a study in methodology. Like, how do you argue? What is your foundation?
Right. If you've ever found yourself in a theological debate at, say, Thanksgiving dinner, or deep in some massive Facebook comment thread, you know exactly how fast these things devolve.
Oh, instantly.
Right. So this deep dive is really a masterclass in how to spot logical fallacies, how to construct a robust biblical argument, and maybe most importantly, how to stop talking past each other when everyone in the virtual room claims to be reading from the exact same Bible.
Which is the hardest part, really.
It is. So let's just drop right into the action. The trap is set, the picnic basket is open, and Nos wanders in.
And he's just immediately confused.
He really is. He's looking at the prompt for the room, which is John 8.43 through 47. And he admits right off the bat that he doesn't know much about Calvinism. But he assumes, given the title Exposing Calvinism, that this room is meant to expose it as a heresy.
Right, which makes sense based on the title.
So he politely asks Matt, what about this passage exposes Calvinism? And Matt, without missing a single beat, just sets the hook.
Yeah, Matt goes straight to the text, which is always the best opening move. In John 8.43, Jesus is speaking directly to the Pharisees, and Jesus asks them, why do you not understand what I say?
And then he gives the answer.
Exactly. In a very characteristic move, Jesus answers his own question. He says, it is because you cannot bear to hear my word.
So Matt points out that Jesus is teaching total inability here. Not just an unwillingness, but an actual inability. And then Matt moves down to verse 47. Whoever is of God hears the words of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God.
That is such a crucial verse.
It is. And here's where the theology gets really interesting and where Matt establishes a core Reformed doctrine right out of the gate. Nature precedes choice. You have to literally be of God first in order to hear the words of God. It's not the other way around.
We really need to pause here because this is so fundamental from a confessional Calvinist perspective. We were talking about the doctrine of total depravity. But, depravity is sometimes a really confusing word for people.
Yeah, they think it means everyone is as evil as humanly possible, like we're all serial killers.
Exactly. A much more precise, functional description is total inability. The unregenerate person, the natural man, just does not have the moral capacity to choose God or to even spiritually hear and understand the things of God. The will is completely bound by the nature.
Let's unpack that mechanism a bit for the listener. Because when people hear your will is bound, they immediately think of a robot.
Right.
They think of determinism in a cold, mechanical way, like God is just pulling levers. So how does nature actually dictate the will without violating human agency?
That's a great question. So think of the will like a scale. It will always tip toward the heaviest desire. A human being is always making choices, completely free from external coercion. But, and this is the massive but here, what dictates our desire.
Our nature.
Right, our nature. If your nature is fallen, corrupted by sin, your deepest, heaviest desires will always incline toward rebellion against God or, toward self-righteousness. Your will is essentially a slave to your sinful nature.
So you are freely choosing exactly what you want. But because of your fallen nature, you never actually want the true God.
Yes, precisely. You only choose rebellion until God changes your nature through regeneration. And Matt grounds this perfectly. He doesn't start with philosophical musings or complex logic yet. He starts with the red letters. He starts with Christ's own diagnosis of the human condition.
The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God.
Exactly. The state of being precedes the action of hearing.
And when Matt drops this truth bomb on Nas, asking him point blank, can they choose to hear him? Nas's reaction is genuinely shocking.
It really is surprising.
I mean, you'd expect the free will defense to immediately deploy. You'd expect him to start caveating the verse. But Nas says, nope. He completely agrees with Matt. He tracks right along with him.
Which is wild for an Adventist.
Total shocker. Nas even brings up the concept of being born again from John 3. He tells the room, did you choose to be physically born? No. So did you choose to be born of the Spirit? No. He goes on to drop Philippians 2.13, quoting, it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure.
It is a fascinating moment of accidental agreement. Nas mentions he's been drawing on a Calvinist YouTuber he watches, someone he refers to as a messenger of truth.
Which is a very high compliment in an apologetics room.
It is, and Nas freely admits that if God is truly sovereign, human free will shouldn't override God's will. He literally says God has the freest will.
Then another speaker in the room, Sissy Augustin, she chimes in and offers this really sharp clarification. She points out the Calvinist position precisely. She says God cannot act against his nature. He cannot lie. He cannot sin. Yet he is supremely free.
Right.
In the exact same way, fallen humans also act according to their nature. We sin because we are sinners.
That is the bondage of the will synthesized flawlessly right there. People often define free will as libertarian free will, which is the ability to make contrary choices in an absolute vacuum.
Right, like an uncaused cause.
Exactly. But that doesn't exist. God is totally free, yet he cannot sin. The fallen man makes choices freely according to his desires, but his desires are completely corrupted. So he only freely chooses rebellion.
Okay, I hear what you're saying about the theology, but I have to push back on this interaction for a second. Is this actually a theological win for Matt, or is this just semantic overlap?
What do you mean?
Well, Nas is a Seventh-day Adventist. They are highly synergistic. Does Nas actually believe in total inability, or is he just parroting verses that sound good in the moment without realizing they completely obliterate his own theological framework?
Oh, it's definitely the latter, which is what makes the dynamic so incredibly rich to listen to. Theological systems act like a pair of tinted glasses. When you are raised in a synergistic tradition, one that teaches God and man cooperate for salvation, which Adventism absolutely does, your glasses have a really thick free will tint.
Right, so everything you read is filtered through that.
Exactly. So when you look at Romans 9 or John 8, those texts are blindingly bright. They clash violently with the tint. So the natural defense mechanism is to caveat them to death.
You hear things like, well, God predestines based on foreseen faith.
Yes. Or God's sovereignty is just him looking down the corridor of time and knowing what we will eventually choose. What is remarkable about Nas here is that he seems to have temporarily taken those tinted glasses off. He isn't filtering the text. He's just reading it for what it says.
He has this wonderful posture of humility, recognizing that if God is the sovereign boss, our job is to just listen.
Yeah, the humility is awesome.
But the social unawareness is just hilarious. Nas is dropping all this sovereignty truth, totally tracking with Matt, but he remains fundamentally confused about why the room is called Exposing Calvinism. He tells them, you guys know these already, I'm wasting my breath. What is the angle here? He completely misses the thick, heavy sarcasm dripping from Matt and JT.
Right, because Matt is deadpanning the whole thing. He's acting like this disinterested investigator while laying out confessional Reformed theology.
JT actually has to step in and explain the joke to Nas. He literally says it's a bit of tongue-in-cheek because Clubhouse rooms are full of people who call Calvinists demons in human flesh suits.
Which is pretty accurate for the internet, to be fair.
It is. But can we just pause and picture this for a second? Yeah. Listening to Nas agree with God's absolute, unyielding sovereignty while earnestly questioning the room title. It's like a guy casually strolling into a theological buzzsaw, leaning over and complimenting the operator on how sharp the teeth are.
That's the perfect analogy.
He's standing right in the middle of this reformed stronghold, nodding his head, completely unaware that his own denominational framework is about to get shredded.
Because that is exactly what happens next. Matt sees this. He recognizes that Oz is intellectually honest, but he's wearing Adventist lenses. So Matt decides to test those lenses. Having accidentally found agreement on God's sovereignty, Matt pivots the crosshairs directly onto Nos's home turf.
He goes after the absolute elephant in the Adventist room.
And this brings us to one of the wildest pivots in the whole recording, the 1844 investigative judgment brawl.
Yes. So Matt questions Ines on Seventh-day Adventist specifics. For you listening, if you aren't familiar with this, it centers around a highly unique doctrine called the investigative judgment.
Very unique to them.
Extremely. This is the belief that Christ didn't actually enter the heavenly Holy of Holies to complete his atoning work upon his ascension in the 1st century. Instead, they believe he waited until the year 1844.
We really need to explain the history here so the listener understands the sheer weight of what Matt is attacking. This doctrine wasn't born out of some fresh, rigorous exegesis of the Greek New Testament. It was born out of something historically known as the Great Disappointment.
Which is exactly what it sounds like.
Yeah. In the 1830s and 40s, a Baptist preacher named William Miller predicted that Jesus would literally return to earth. He based this on a really unique reading of Daniel 8.14, which talks about the sanctuary being cleansed. Miller calculated the exact date to be October 22, 1844.
And spoiler alert for the listener, Jesus did not return on October 22 to 1844.
Precisely. His followers, the Millerites, were absolutely devastated. But instead of abandoning the failed prophecy entirely, a massive, faith-saving theological shift occurred. A follower named Hiram Edson claimed to have a sudden revelation while walking through a cornfield.
A cornfield revelation.
Yeah.
Always a solid theological foundation.
Right, so he said that the sanctuary to be cleansed wasn't the earth at all, it was the heavenly sanctuary. So the new theology became this. In 1844, Jesus didn't come to earth. He simply moved from the holy place in heaven into the most holy place to begin an investigative judgment of the lives of believers to see who is actually worthy.
Which is just a staggering doctrinal pivot.
Yeah.
And JT, the wingman, actually pulls up this history and reads it out loud to the room to confirm it.
The tension must have been palpable.
Oh, it was. So Matt hears this 1844 doctrine laid bare, and he just launches. I mean, he goes absolutely scorched earth. He pulls out the book of Hebrews, specifically chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10.
Heavy artillery.
And Matt argues that under the Old Covenant, the high priest applied the blood to the mercy seat on the exact same day as the sacrifice, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur.
Right, the typology is immediate.
Exactly. There wasn't an 1800-year gap between slaughtering the goat and walking behind the veil. Therefore, Christ entered the Holy of Holies upon his death and ascension in the 1st century, not in 1844.
This is a textbook example of a Van Tillian presuppositional apologetic approach.
Okay, hold on. I need to challenge you on that label. Is that really a Van Tillian approach, or is that just basic evidential proof texting? Because if he's just throwing Hebrews at him, isn't he just using the Bible as an evidence manual? What makes this specifically presuppositional in a messy Clubhouse room?
That is an excellent distinction to make, and it's a common misunderstanding. It becomes presuppositional because of how Matt uses the text. Cornelius Van Til taught that you don't just throw isolated facts at your opponent, you must step into their worldview, stand on their stated foundation, and show how their worldview completely collapses under its own weight.
Oh, I see. So it's an internal critique.
Exactly. NS claims the Bible is his ultimate standard. Matt steps onto that foundation. He doesn't just quote a single verse. He takes the entire structural typology of the Old Testament, which Adventists deeply revere, by the way, and shows that their 1844 claim breaks the very typology they claim to uphold.
They pride themselves on keeping the law and understanding the Old Covenant.
Right. And Matt shows that the foreshadowing demands immediate application of the blood. Hebrews 9 explicitly says Christ entered the holy places once for all by means of his own blood, securing an eternal redemption. He didn't wait 1800 years in some cosmic waiting room. Matt forces Nos to see that he cannot hold both the book of Hebrews and the 1844 prophecy. One must destroy the other.
Okay, that makes total sense. It's the internal critique that makes it Van Tillian. But let's talk about the actual execution in the room. Because while Matt's exegesis is absolutely lethal, the social dynamic is just absurd.
It's pretty funny.
Matt casually drops this line. He says, "I'm just folding some laundry right now." He is literally matching socks while burying a 150-year-old denominational pillar.
Yeah.
And then he proceeds to read almost 4 entire chapters of Hebrews out loud, live, on a drop-in audio app.
Yeah, that is, frankly, an overwhelming amount of scripture to read in one continuous go in that kind of format.
It's excruciating. If you're listening to a podcast or an audio room like commuting or doing dishes, and a guy starts monotonously reading 4 chapters of dense biblical theology, you're going to tune out.
You're going to check your email.
Exactly. Matt's exegesis is flawless, yes.
Yeah.
But is his Clubhouse bedside manner actually persuasive? I mean, isn't reading 4 chapters of Hebrews like hitting someone with an entire car when a hubcap would have made the point?
It is definitely a huge tactical risk. In a formal, moderated debate with a podium and a time limit, quoting extensively is necessary. In a digital room where people can just swipe away with their thumb, you risk losing your audience entirely.
Right.
However, I will defend Matt's instinct here, even if the execution was tedious. From a theological perspective, Matt's overwhelming use of Scripture serves a very specific purpose. He is demonstrating that the refutation of the 1844 doctrine isn't found in one isolated gotcha verse.
It's the whole argument.
Yes. It is the entire structural bedrock of the book of Hebrews. The high priestly work of Christ, the superiority of the new covenant, the finality of the atonement. You can't just throw a hubcap at the investigative judgment. You need the whole car to show that the entire framework of Hebrews rejects a multi-millennial delay in Christ's intercessory work. The veil was torn then, not in 1844.
That's a really fair defense of the theology, even if the social delivery was a bit brutal. And after Matt essentially parks the entire book of Hebrews on top of the 1844 doctrine, Ness realizes he is severely outgunned.
He's stuck.
He cannot reconcile the timing of the atonement. So what does he do? He tries to pivot. He realizes he's losing the debate on the timing of heaven, so he leads straight into our next major clash, the state of the dead.
This is a classic theological battleground, especially with Seventh-day Adventists.
It really is. So Matt challenges NS on the SDA doctrine of soul sleep. Now, if you aren't familiar with this term, it's the belief in a form of unconsciousness after death, or annihilationism for the wicked.
Right, conditional immortality.
Yes. The idea is that when you die physically, your soul doesn't go to heaven or hell. You're just dead, asleep, completely lacking consciousness until the future resurrection. Nas defends this doctrine using the book of Ecclesiastes, specifically quoting the verse that says, "The dead know nothing."
And Matt counters brilliantly with the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16, the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Matt argues that this text explicitly depicts conscious torment for the rich man and conscious comfort for Lazarus in the bosom of Abraham immediately following their physical deaths.
But Nas plays the absolute standard defense card here. He immediately claims it's just a parable.
Standard response.
Yeah. He argues it isn't a historical account of the afterlife, it's just a story Jesus made up to teach a moral lesson. But Matt is not having it. Matt argues it absolutely cannot be a parable for 2 massive reasons. First, the text uses proper names. It names the beggar, Lazarus, and it names the historical patriarch, Abraham. Jesus never uses proper names in any of his other parables. You don't get the parable of the sower named Steve.
That is such a critical hermeneutical point. It changes the genre.
And the second reason Matt gives is the location. The text treats Hades as a literal place. And we know Hades is a literal place because later, in Revelation 20, Hades is literally cast into the lake of fire at the final judgment. Matt asks the obvious question. If Hades is just a fictional setting in a made-up parable, how does a fictional concept get thrown into a literal lake of fire?
Exactly. And what we are witnessing here is the critical difference between exegesis and eisegesis. And it's a really vital lesson for anyone listening.
Break that down for us.
Sure. Exegesis means drawing the meaning out of the text based on its grammar, its historical context, and its literary genre. Eisegesis means reading your predetermined theology into the text.
Like wearing the tinted glasses again.
Exactly. NS has a predetermined theological commitment. Soul sleep. Therefore, when he reads Luke 16, it simply must be a parable. It has to be, because if it's literal history, soul sleep collapses instantly.
How do you handle his use of Ecclesiastes, though? Because Nas does have a Bible verse that says, "The dead know nothing." He's not just making that up.
This goes right back to basic hermeneutics. Matt correctly points out to Nas that Solomon is writing Ecclesiastes from an earthly perspective, a perspective he repeatedly calls under the sun.
Right, the horizontal view.
Yes. When a person dies, from our horizontal earthly viewpoint, they know nothing. They don't speak to us. They don't participate in the affairs of the living. But that earthly observation doesn't negate the conscious spiritual afterlife revealed by Christ in the New Testament. Christ actually sees behind the veil. You interpret the older, more obscure revelation in light of the newer, clearer revelation of Christ.
The theology there is so deep, but man, we have to talk about the interaction dynamics during this section because it is peak internet debate comedy. The technical failures alone are glorious.
The audio was rough.
Nas keeps breaking up. His audio is severely glitching, prompting Matt to tell him he sounds like a robot talking through a wet tile. There are these painfully awkward stretches where Nas is passionately trying to make a point, but he's totally on mute.
The occupational hazards of modern digital apologetics.
Right. But my absolute favorite part is the tactical dodge. When Nas gets totally cornered on Luke 16, when Matt presses him hard on the use of proper names and the reality of Hades, Nas completely bails. He just abandons Luke 16 entirely and asks Matt to explain Genesis 4.
Out of nowhere.
Specifically, the verse where God says Abel's blood is crying out from the ground. And Moss is trying to construct an argument saying, see, blood doesn't literally cry out, so therefore Luke 16 doesn't literally mean they're conscious. It's such a wild, frantic pivot that Chris, another speaker in the room who has been quiet this whole time, finally just unmutes and voices everyone's frustration. He literally yells over the audio, how does Genesis 4 relate to soul sleep at all?
It is the ultimate red herring. I mean, when the text you are defending becomes utterly indefensible, the natural human reaction is to attempt to force your opponent to defend a completely different, seemingly metaphorical text.
You just want to change the subject.
Yeah, you try to muddy the waters regarding literal interpretation across the whole Bible so you don't have to deal with the specific text in front of you.
It is infuriating to listen to.
Yeah.
It's like you are losing a tennis match, you're getting frustrated, so you grab the tennis ball, sprint out of the stadium, and demand your opponent play you in a game of bowling. It's a completely different sport. So as an expert, how do you handle that? If you're listening to this and you're in a debate with a family member who pulls a maneuver like this, how do you stop the gish gallop? How do you keep someone on track when they panic jump across the Bible to escape a losing point?
It requires immense discipline on your part. You have to refuse the new premise until the current one is resolved.
Don't take the bait.
Right. And Matt handles this fairly well. He briefly addresses Genesis 4 just to show he isn't intimidated by it. He quickly explains that the blood crying out is a metaphor for God's justice against murder, which is obviously expounded upon later in Genesis 9 with the institution of capital punishment. But then, crucially, Matt forcefully drags the conversation back to Luke 16.
He doesn't let him escape.
No, he refuses to let the rich man and Lazarus be swept under the rug. If you are in this situation, you have to explicitly expose the dodge. You say, I'm happy to discuss Genesis 4, but only after we conclude our exegesis of Luke 16. You haven't answered my point about the proper names. You lock the door behind them so they can't flee the room.
Which Matt definitely does. And Nas's desperate attempt to just label Luke 16 a parable, purely because the chapters before it contain parables, triggers Matt into his final form. This is where the theological debate morphs into a live community college logic course.
This is where the presuppositional rubber really meets the road.
Oh, absolutely. Matt explicitly calls out Nas for committing formal logical fallacies. He diagnoses Nas with the fallacy of induction. Nas assumed that because previous stories in the Gospel of Luke were parables, this one must be a parable too.
Which is a huge leap.
Matt uses this great analogy to explain it to him. He calls it the red house analogy. If you drive down a street and the last 15 houses you saw were red, it doesn't mean the 16th house will be red. Assuming it will be is a non sequitur. It simply does not logically follow.
And Matt doesn't stop there. He accuses Nas of begging the question and special pleading.
Matt is so deep in his zone here that he actually pulls up the chat feature on Clubhouse and starts typing out formal logic definitions. He talks about the definition for modus ponens, modus tollens, and the fallacy of asserting the consequence so Nas can screenshot them, again, while folding laundry.
It is an incredible display of intellectual dominance, but we really need to understand why logic matters in theology. From a Ventilian perspective, logic is not some neutral, secular Greek construct that exists independently out in the universe, somehow divorced from God.
All right, it's not just a human invention.
No, logic reflects the consistent, non-contradictory nature of God himself. God cannot lie. God cannot be both A and not A at the same time and in the same relationship. Therefore, committing logical fallacies in theology isn't just a minor academic oopsie. It is fundamentally misrepresenting the truth, and by extension, misrepresenting the God of truth.
I love that framing. It elevates logic from a parlor trick to a matter of reverence. But let's translate Matt's logic lesson into simpler terms for everyone listening, because these Latin phrases can get dense. How is Nos actually violating logic here?
Okay, so Nos's core argument is essentially this. Jesus told 4 parables in a row. Therefore, the 5th story Jesus tells is a parable. This is formally invalid. As Matt pointed out, it is an inductive fallacy because it takes a limited set of past experiences and demands that the future must strictly conform to them, ignoring new data.
The new data being the proper names.
Exactly. Let's look at the fallacy of asserting the consequent, which Matt brought up. The valid form is, if it rains, the ground is wet. It rained, therefore the ground is wet. Asserting the consequent flips it. If it rains, the ground is wet. The ground is wet, therefore it rained.
Right, which is false because someone could have just sprayed a hose. The wet ground doesn't prove rain.
Exactly. Nos is doing a version of this. He assumes his conclusion that the text is a parable in order to prove his premise that the soul sleeps. He's begging the question.
Now, I have to praise Nos here. This is where Nos shows incredible character. Think about it. Most people, when hit with a barrage of Latin logic terms in a public forum, would get defensive, mute themselves, or just angrily leave the room.
Flight or fight kicks in immediately.
But Nos shows such profound humility in this exact moment. He admits he is confused. He asks genuine questions. He literally tells Matt he is screenshotting the logic notes from the chat to study them later. It is a stunning display of teachability.
It is easily the absolute highlight of the interaction. It shows that while Nos's theology is heavily bound by his tradition, his personal disposition is genuinely seeking truth.
But I'm going to push back on Matt's method again. I get the Van Tillian necessity of logic. But is throwing terms like modus tollens and asserting the consequence at a guy who just learned what a non sequitur is actually helpful? Or is it theological grandstanding? Where is the line between educating an opponent and intellectually bludgeoning them with academic terms they don't understand just to secure a victory?
It is a razor-thin line, and Matt skates right on the edge of it. On one hand, you must define the rules of engagement. If someone is continuously using faulty logical machinery, you cannot make exegetical progress until you fix the machine.
Right, you can't build a house with a broken hammer.
But on the other hand, vocabulary can be weaponized. Using high-level academic jargon can absolutely be a way of establishing dominance rather than fostering understanding. I think Matt saves himself from pure arrogance because he actually takes the time to type it out and explain the analogies, like the rain and the wet ground.
Sure.
He makes it accessible, even if hitting him with the Latin terms out of nowhere was a bit much.
Which brings us to the final part of our deep dive. Having dissected the arguments, the theology, and the heavy logic, it is time to pull out the practical blueprints for you, the listener. How can you apply the chaos of this Clubhouse room to your own conversations? Let's break down the takeaways.
If we synthesize this entire 2-hour brawl, we have to look at persuasiveness in 2 categories: argument and character.
Objectively, Matt won the logical and theological arguments handily. His exegesis of Hebrews was tighter, his logic on Luke 16 was sound, and his defense of God's sovereignty from John 8 was airtight.
No question.
But Nos was incredibly persuasive in his character. He showed a rare humility and a willingness to learn that you almost never see in internet debates. So based directly on what we heard, let's lay out 3 tips for better theological debates. The DAWs.
Tip number 1, define your terms immediately. We saw this early on when Nos was talking about free will, and Matt stopped the train and demanded to know, what do you mean by free? Are you talking about absolute libertarian freedom or freedom within the bounds of a fallen nature?
If you don't define your terms, you'll spend 2 hours fighting over a word you define completely differently.
Exactly.
Tip number 2, let the text dictate the category. Don't force your theology onto the text. When Matt recognized the proper names in Luke 16, Lazarus, and Abraham, he let the textual evidence dictate the genre. The text demanded it be read as historical narrative. Nos tried to force the parable category onto the text because his soul sleep theology required it. Always let the text lead.
Tip number 3, be willing to admit when you don't know something. Nos was a rock star at this. When Matt started throwing out complex logic terms, Nos stopped and said, I don't know what that is. Can you explain? That vulnerability instantly de-escalated the tension and turned a combative brawl into a classroom.
Okay, those are the DAWs. Now for the 3 don'ts. Things not to do in theological debates, brought to you by our Clubhouse friends. Number 1, don't read 4 chapters of the Bible aloud without stopping. Please, I'm begging you. Just quote the relevant verses and summarize the structural argument. Matt's Hebrews monologue was exegetically brilliant, but socially brutal. Remember,
Okay.
hubcap, not a car. Give them the piece they need. Don't run them over with the whole vehicle.
Number 2,
Yeah,
don't use the fallacy of induction to ignore text that challenges your theology. Just because God operated one way in the last chapter doesn't mean he is bound to operate that exact same way in the next.
Right.
Don't assume Luke 16 is a parable just because the previous stories were. Deal honestly with the text in front of you.
And number 3, don't panic jump to a completely different book in the Bible when you are losing an exegetical point. When Noah started drowning in Luke 16, he grabbed his bowling ball and ran to Genesis 4. It's a transparent dodge, and everyone in the room sees it. Stand your ground, deal with the text, or concede the point.
This all highlights a massive, pervasive problem we see in these debates, the Christian echo chamber. This is the danger where both sides are using the exact same vocabulary, words like sleep, death, free will, or atonement, but they're using completely different dictionaries.
It happens all the time.
An Adventist says atonement and thinks of an ongoing investigative process culminating in 1844. A Calvinist says atonement and thinks of a definitively finished work on the cross in the 1st century. If you don't demand definitions before debating doctrines, you will talk past each other into eternity.
Let me give you one final analogy from the room to really hammer this home. Later in the recording, they had a debate over Enoch in Hebrews 11. Nos argued that Enoch didn't see death because Hebrews 11.5 says he was taken up. But Matt pointed out that the summary verse, Hebrews 11.13, explicitly says these all died in faith, which contextually includes Enoch.
Nos couldn't reconcile it.
My analogy for this is if I tell you everyone at the party ate cake, but earlier in the story I told you Bob ate his cake through a feeding tube, Bob still ate the cake. He just ate it in a completely different mode. Enoch died, meaning he transitioned from the earthly realm. He just did it in a different mode. Assumption rather than physical expiration. How do you handle people who hyperfixate on one verse, like verse 5, to destroy the context of the whole chapter, like verse 13?
You have to relentlessly anchor them to the author's concluding summary. You point out that interpreting verse 5 in a way that directly contradicts verse 13 makes the inspired author of Hebrews a liar or a fool. You must interpret the specific, unusual instance, Enoch's translation, in light of the clear, universal summary. These all died in faith. You force the obscure parts to submit to the clear whole.
Which is exactly what Matt did, and it is a brilliant tactic. And that wraps up our deep dive. What an absolute wild ride of an audio file. We started in a digital room filled with audio glitches, laundry folding, and brutal logic smackdowns. But it ultimately centered on vital, beautiful truths about Christ's finished work as our high priest and God's absolute, undeniable sovereignty over the hearts of men.
It truly is a testament to the power of Scripture that it can shine through and effectively convict even through the most chaotic mediums.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Think about your own deeply held traditions. Are there doctrines you hold on to purely because of the fallacy of induction? Do you believe something just because the last 4 houses were read? And ask yourself, how much of your theology requires you to redefine basic words just to keep your theological system from completely collapsing? Keep your Bibles open, test everything by the text, and always check your mute button before making a profound theological point.
Sage advice for the digital age.
Until next time on TheoBrawlz.